The rider hit the packed dirt of the training yard with a sound Marlowe felt in her own teeth. Thrown clean off Nyx's back, the instant his hand had grazed the old scar tissue along the dragon's left wing, and the whole yard went silent, except for Nyx's furious, wounded roar echoing off the stable walls. This was the 9th rider this season to end up in the dirt, for the exact same reason, reaching for the exact same spot, and Marlowe watched from the fence line with her heart hammering, cataloging the pattern the way she cataloged everything, carefully, and with the particular attention of someone who had learned the hard way what happened when nobody bothered to ask why. Nyx retreated to the far corner of the yard, wings pulled tight against a body too magnificent to be hiding the way he was hiding, and fixed his black eyes on the fallen rider being carried off with an expression Marlowe would have called fear on anything smaller. She had been assigned to the core stables only 3 weeks earlier, low enough in rank that no one expected her opinion on anything, and she had already noticed what none of the senior trainers seemed willing to say aloud. Nyx did not attack out of malice. He attacked only when that one specific point along his wing was touched, every single time, with a consistency that had nothing to do with a dragon simply being difficult. "Get back from the fence," Instructor Voss barked at her, striding past with the clipped, irritated authority of a man who had lost his 9th rider to injury this season and blamed everyone in sight except himself. Marlowe stepped back obediently, but her eyes stayed on Nyx, on the way he curled protectively around the injured wing, even now that the threat had passed, and she felt the old, familiar ache rise in her chest, the one she had carried for 4 years since a crash that should never have happened took her sister out of the sky forever. I think it matters, before this story goes any further, that Marlowe had not taken a stable position by accident. She had studied dragon anatomy in secret for years. In books nobody else at the Corps bothered to read past their required exams. Chasing an answer to a question the official inquiry into her sister's death had never satisfactorily provided. Watching Nyx flinch from that one precise point on his wing, she felt, for the first time in 4 years, the terrible electric sensation of a question finally circling its answer. She had chosen the lowest, least glamorous position the Corps offered on purpose, mucking stables and hauling feed, rather than pursuing the rider training her aptitude scores had technically qualified her for, because riders were watched closely and questioned constantly about their intentions, while stable-hands moved through the grounds largely unnoticed. It had taken her 3 weeks to maneuver an assignment anywhere near Nyx's enclosure, 3 weeks of patient, deliberate positioning that none of her supervisors had thought worth remarking on, and watching him thrown a 9th time felt, to her, less like an accident of scheduling and more like the exact confirmation she had spent 4 years quietly working toward. Marlowe requested Nyx's full medical history that evening, citing routine stable duties as her reason, and spent half the night poring over records that told her considerably less than she needed to know. The wing injury was listed simply as an old training accident, sustained 2 years earlier, healed adequately though with permanent stiffness noted. No further detail, no name attached to the incident, just the bland, bureaucratic language the Corps used for anything it preferred not to examine too closely. The same language, she remembered with a cold jolt, that had described her sister's fatal crash as an unfortunate structural failure during a routine exercise. She had lost Ren 4 years ago, a bright, fearless rider 3 years older than Marlowe who had bonded early and flown with a joy Marlowe still dreamed about some nights, until a training flight ended in a crash that the official inquiry attributed to an unexpected wing failure nobody could have predicted. Marlowe had never believed that explanation, not fully, not with the particular wrongness she felt every time she reread the thin, unsatisfying report, but she had been 16 at the time, and utterly without the standing to demand a fuller investigation. She had joined the Corps 5 years later determined to find, quietly and on her own terms, whatever the official record had left out. Alistair, the Corps' chief investigator for training incidents, found her still awake over the records near midnight, having noticed the requisition pass through his own desk, with a flag that suggested unusual interest from an unusually junior stablehand. He studied her across the small records room, with an expression that mixed professional suspicion with something more careful underneath it, and Marlowe felt herself go very still under the weight of his attention. "You requested Nix's full injury history," he said. Not quite an accusation, though close enough to one that Marlowe's pulse spiked. That is an unusual thing for a new stablehand to want, unless she already has a reason to suspect the official record is incomplete. Marlowe met his gaze steadily, unwilling to let him see how close he had already come to a truth she had not planned on sharing with anyone this soon. She had heard other stablehands describe Alistair in passing over her 3 weeks at the Corps, always with a mixture of respect and wariness, a man known for pulling apart official reports until they either held together under scrutiny or fell apart entirely, and she understood now, sitting across from him in the quiet records room, exactly why his reputation carried the weight it did. His questions were not idle curiosity. They were precise, patient pressure, applied in exactly the places a person hiding something would feel it most, and Marlowe found herself both unsettled and, despite the danger of it, quietly impressed. "I like to understand the animals I care for," Marlowe said, careful and even, though Alistair's sharp, assessing eyes told her plainly he was not fully convinced. He was younger than she expected for someone holding the Corps' chief investigator position, dark-haired and precise in his movements, with the particular watchfulness of a man who had learned not to take official explanations at face value. He set her requisition slip down on the table between them, with deliberate care. "Your sister was Wren Ashdown," he said quietly, and Marlowe's breath caught at the sound of the name spoken aloud by someone who had clearly already connected threads she had hoped to keep separate for a while longer. "The crash 4 years ago. I pulled your personnel file when your requisition flagged, and I noticed the surname before I noticed anything else." His expression was not unkind, but it was guarded, the careful neutrality of a man trying to determine whether the woman in front of him was pursuing a legitimate concern or an old, unresolved grief that might compromise an ongoing investigation. "I am not trying to sabotage anything," Marlowe said, sharper than she intended, the accusation she read in his careful tone landing harder than she expected it to. "I noticed a pattern in a dragon's behaviour that none of the senior trainers seem interested in explaining honestly, and it happens to resemble a pattern I have spent 4 years trying to understand about my sister's death. I would think an investigator, of all people, might find that worth examining instead of suspecting." Alistair's jaw tightened, something shifting behind his controlled expression that looked, for just a moment, like reluctant respect, rather than continued suspicion. "I am not accusing you of anything yet," he said, quieter now. "I am telling you that I have my own unanswered questions about Nix's injury, and that 2 people chasing the same unexplained pattern from different directions might do better working together than working around each other." Marlowe studied him for a long moment, weighing 4 years of careful, solitary grief against the unfamiliar offer of an ally, before finally, cautiously, nodding. "I have one condition," she added, before he could consider the alliance settled. "Whatever we find, we follow it wherever it actually leads, even if it points somewhere neither of us expects or wants it to." "I did not spend 4 years chasing careful half-truths to build a new one now." Alistair studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. "Agreed," he said simply, and extended his hand across the table, a small, formal gesture that felt, to Marlowe, considerably larger than its size suggested. Marlowe approached Nix 3 days later during the quiet pre-dawn hours, when the yard stood empty of the trainers and riders whose presence seemed to trigger his worst defensiveness, and knelt at a careful distance from the injured wing, speaking low and steady the way she had once spoken to spook horses on her family's farm, before she ever came to the Corps. Nix watched her with wary, unblinking attention, tension coiled through every line of his enormous body, but he did not retreat, and he did not attack. "I am not going to touch it unless you let me," she told him, inching closer with excruciating patience, her heart hammering with a fear she refused to let reach her hands. "I only want to look. I think someone hurt you on purpose, a long time ago, and I do not think anyone has ever actually asked you that plainly before." Nix's black eyes tracked her every movement, and when her fingers finally, gently, reached the edge of the scarred tissue, he went rigid, every instinct clearly screaming at him to throw her the way he had thrown 9 riders before her. He did not throw her. He held himself in a trembling, visible stillness, and let her fingers trace the old injury with a care no one had apparently ever offered him, and Marlowe felt her breath catch at what her hands found beneath the scale. Not the smooth, even mend of a natural fracture healed under proper care, but the uneven, forced knitting of a bone that had been deliberately, violently rebroken and reset in haste, the unmistakable signature of an injury inflicted rather than accidental. "Someone did this to you," she said, quiet and furious, tears she did not fully understand rising in her eyes. "Someone broke this wing on purpose and let it heal wrong, and then blamed you for every rider who touched it wrong afterward." Nix made a low, aching sound deep in his chest and lowered his massive head until it rested against her shoulder, a gesture of trust so unexpected and so total that Marlowe found herself weeping openly, overwhelmed by 4 years of grief, finally finding a thread that might, at last, lead somewhere true. She stayed with him a long while after that, long past the point when the yard began to stir with the ordinary business of morning feedings, unwilling to leave him alone with the weight of what they had just uncovered together. Nix seemed equally reluctant to let her go, his head remaining heavy against her shoulder, even as other stable hands began appearing at the edges of the yard, and Marlowe found herself smiling through the last of her tears at the sheer, stubborn devotion of a creature who had waited 2 long years for exactly this kind of gentleness and did not intend to release it easily now that he finally had it. Alistair found her there at full dawn, kneeling with Nix's head resting trustingly against her shoulder, and stopped dead at the edge of the yard, stunned by a sight that contradicted everything 2 years of official corps reports had insisted was true about the dragon's temperament. He crossed the yard slowly, careful not to startle either of them, and knelt beside Marlowe to examine what her hands had found, his own trained fingers confirming within moments what she had already suspected. "This was not an accident," he said, low and grim, tracing the uneven fracture line with the same careful precision he brought to every investigation. "This was force, applied fast and without proper setting afterward. Someone did this to him, and then let the corps believe it was a training mishap." He looked up at Marlowe, something raw moving behind his controlled expression. "I need to know how you got him to let you this close, because 9 trained riders could not manage what you just did in a single quiet morning." "I asked instead of took," Marlowe said simply, still catching her breath from the weight of what they had just confirmed together. "I think that is the whole of it. I think somebody took something from him once, violently, and every rider who has come at him since has reminded him of exactly that." Alistair absorbed the observation in silence, his gaze moving from the old injury to Marlowe's tear-streaked face with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last few minutes, from professional partnership into something considerably warmer. "Your sister's crash," he said carefully. "I pulled the full incident file last night, the parts that were never included in the public inquiry. The wing that failed on Ren's dragon carries the exact same signature of forced, hasty resetting that we just found on Nix. I think whoever injured this dragon 2 years ago may be the same person responsible for the wing that failed under your sister 4 years earlier." Marlowe felt the ground tilt beneath her. 4 years of unanswered grief suddenly, terribly, converging on a single name neither of them had yet dared to speak aloud. Alistair reached for her hand without seeming to fully decide to, steadying her through the moment the way he had steadied the fracture line minutes earlier, and Marlowe let him, grateful beyond words for a presence that did not flinch away from grief the way so many well-meaning people had over the last 4 years. "Say it," she told him, quiet and resolute, despite the tremor still running through her. "Whatever name you are hesitating to say, I have already carried worse than a name for 4 years. I can carry this too." "Voss," Alistair said finally, the name landing in the quiet yard, like a verdict neither of them wanted to deliver. "He was the senior trainer assigned to your sister's dragon 4 years ago, before he was promoted to his current instructor position. He was also, according to the maintenance logs I found last night, the last person recorded alone with Nix the week before his wing injury was first reported." Marlowe felt fury and grief tangled together so completely in her chest that she could not immediately separate one from the other. 4 years of careful, solitary suspicion finally given a face and a name. "He forced a bond on my sister's dragon that was never ready for one," she said, her voice shaking with a rage she had kept banked for 4 long years. The dragon panicked mid-flight, because the wing he damaged failed, under the exact stress a proper bond should never have demanded of it yet, and my sister paid for his carelessness with her life. And 2 years ago he did the same thing to Nyx, and covered it up the same careless way, and nobody in this entire corps ever thought to connect the 2 incidents until I got assigned to mucking out stables 3 weeks ago. Alistair's hand found hers, steady and grounding amid the storm of her grief. "We connect them now," he said, quiet and resolute. "I have spent 2 years chasing an explanation for Nyx's behaviour that the official reports refuse to give me honestly. I am not walking away from proof this concrete, simply because the man responsible outranks me." Marlowe looked up at him, startled by the unwavering certainty in his voice, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since she was 16 years old, and burying a sister, the corps had never properly grieved with her. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked, quiet, needing to understand the shape of an ally who had appeared so suddenly and so completely in her corner. Alistair's expression softened, unguarded for the first time since she had met him. "Because I became an investigator to stop exactly this kind of careless harm from hiding behind official language," he said. "And because watching you with Nyx this morning, I think I have been waiting a long time to meet someone who cares about the truth as fiercely as I have always wanted to." Marlowe felt the confession settle over her, with a warmth that surprised her, unaccustomed as she was to anyone naming their regard for her so plainly, and found herself, for one unguarded moment, simply letting herself feel it, instead of immediately turning back to the investigation. "I do not know how to answer that properly right now," she admitted, quiet and honest. "There is too much else demanding my attention to give a feeling like that the space it deserves. But I want you to know I heard it, and I do not intend to forget that you said it once this is over." Voss learned of their investigation faster than either of them expected, a leaked word from a records clerk sympathetic to his seniority, and moved to protect himself with the same careless speed that had caused 2 disasters already. He filed an emergency recommendation the following morning to have Nyx destroyed as an unmanageable liability, citing the 9th rider's injury as final proof the dragon could not be safely kept, a recommendation that would, if approved, erase the last physical evidence of what he had done before Marlowe and Alistair could bring it before anyone with the authority to stop him. "He is trying to bury the evidence along with the dragon," Alistair said grimly, reading the emergency order that had crossed his desk within the hour, urgency replacing the careful patience of their investigation so far. "The Council votes on destruction orders within 48 hours of filing. We do not have time to build the case the proper way anymore." Marlowe felt panic rise sharp and immediate. 4 years of patient searching suddenly compressed into a window of less than 2 days. "Then, we do not wait for the proper way," she said, echoing a resolve she had not known she possessed, until the words left her mouth. "We bring what we already have directly to the Council ourselves, tonight, before Voss has time to bury anything else." Alistair studied her for a long moment, weighing the risk of moving before their case was fully built against the far greater risk of losing both the dragon and the truth to a 48-hour deadline neither of them controlled. "If we do this and it fails," he said quietly, "Voss will make certain both our careers end with it." Marlowe took his hand, steady despite the fear humming through her chest. "I already lost my sister to his carelessness," she told him. "I am not losing the only proof of what he did to save a career I only took to find this exact truth in the first place. I would rather lose everything trying than let him bury this a second time." Alistair spent the remaining hours before the council session compiling every scrap of evidence into a presentation methodical enough to survive scrutiny, while Marlowe wrote out her sister's full history in her own hand for the first time in 4 years, forcing herself through the details she had spent so long avoiding in favor of quiet, private grief. It was harder than she expected, laying it all out in plain language for strangers who had never known Ren at all. But she found, somewhere in the writing, that giving the grief a clear shape finally made it feel less like something she carried alone. They stood before the Core Council that same night, presenting the medical records, the maintenance logs, and the physical evidence of Nix's deliberately forced injury, with a clarity that left little room for the council to dismiss, and Voss, called to answer the accusation directly, grew visibly more desperate with every question Alistair pressed him on, his careful denials fraying under the weight of details only the actual culprit could have gotten so consistently wrong. When Marlowe finally produced her sister's original incident file, cross-referenced against Nix's matching injury pattern, the room fell into a silence that told her plainly the council understood exactly what they were looking at. Voss broke under the accumulated weight of it, admitting in a desperate, unraveling confession that he had forced early bonds on both dragons to inflate his own advancement record, and that both injuries had been the direct, careless result of pushing dragons toward bonds their bodies were not yet ready to bear. The confession, delivered before the full council, ended not only his career, but the destruction order against Nix in the same devastating hour, and Marlowe stood in the council chamber shaking with 4 years of grief, finally, impossibly, given the vindication it had waited so long to receive. Several council members rose to offer her formal apologies once the confession concluded, acknowledging the inadequacy of the original inquiry into her sister's death, and Marlowe accepted each one with a composure that cost her considerably more than it appeared to. 4 years of careful, solitary grief finally being witnessed by people with the authority to have prevented it in the first place. It was not the ending she had imagined during all those long nights poring over an unsatisfying report. It was, she found, considerably better, because it had not required her to stop believing in a truth nobody else had been willing to chase. Nix, brought before the council as evidence, seemed to sense the shift in the room the moment Voss's confession was complete, and turned his great head toward Marlowe with an unmistakable, searching attention that cut through the formal proceedings entirely. Alistair caught the look and squeezed her hand where it rested still trembling in his own. "I think he knows," he murmured. "I think 2 years of silence just ended in that confession, and he wants you to be the one who tells him it is finally over." The council chamber emptied slowly around them, officials still murmuring over the scale of Voss's confession, but Marlowe barely registered any of it. Her whole attention narrowed to the enormous, exhausted dragon, watching her from across the yard, with an expression she could only describe as hope finally permitted to surface after 2 long years of guarding against it. She crossed the distance between them without a moment's hesitation, all the careful patience of the past week collapsing into something simpler and more urgent now that the danger had finally, fully passed. Marlowe crossed to Nix the moment the council session closed, kneeling before him in the same careful, patient posture she had used every dawn for the past week, and found the dragon lowering himself fully to the ground in front of her, exposing the traditional point of offering beneath his jaw with a deliberateness that needed no manual to interpret. "It's over," she told him, her voice breaking on the words. "Voss cannot hurt you, or anyone else ever again. You do not have to brace for the next hand that reaches for that wing, expecting harm." She rested her palm against the offered scale, and felt a bond settle into place that carried, within it, the full weight of 2 years of a dragon's patient, wounded waiting, a bond given freely to the first person who had ever asked what happened to him, instead of simply demanding he perform past it. Nix made a sound Marlowe had never heard from him before, something between relief and pure, uncomplicated joy, and she found herself laughing through tears at the sheer, overwhelming scale of an ending she had spent 4 years afraid to hope for. I have read a line from the writer Victor Hugo, that to love another person is to see the face of God, and I think of Marlowe kneeling in that yard, offering a wounded dragon the plain, patient kindness that had once been stolen from both him and her sister by the same careless hand. She had not set out that morning to find love. She had set out to find the truth. It turned out, in the end, that the two had been waiting in the same place all along. Alistair watched the bond form with an expression Marlowe caught only once she finally looked up, something unguarded and entirely undone moving across his face, the look of a man who had spent his whole career chasing careful, procedural truth, and had just watched something far larger than procedure settle into the yard in front of him. He did not interrupt the moment, holding back at a respectful distance until the bond had fully settled and Marlowe finally rose from her knees, and when she turned to find him still watching, she saw in his expression none of the careful investigator's neutrality he had greeted her with in the records room a week earlier. What remained instead was something entirely undisguised, and Marlowe found she did not want him to disguise it any longer either. "I owe you an apology," Alistair said quietly, once Nix had finally settled beside them both, exhausted and at peace for what looked like the first time in 2 years. "I suspected you, that first night in the records room, of chasing something that might compromise an investigation I had already half given up on solving alone. I did not yet understand that the person I suspected was the only one in this entire corps who actually cared enough to keep looking." Marlowe reached for his hand, steady now, in a way 4 years of grief had never quite let her be. "You do not owe me an apology," she told him. "You owe me nothing except what you already gave, which was believing me the moment the evidence asked you to. I have spent 4 years watching people close ranks around convenient explanations. I did not expect to find an investigator willing to tear his own institution open instead." Alistair's expression softened further. Something he had clearly been holding carefully in check finally allowed to surface without restraint. "I did not do it only for the investigation," he admitted, low. "I did it because somewhere in the last week, watching you kneel in the dirt every dawn, asking a wounded dragon what he actually needed, instead of what the Corps expected him to perform, I fell in love with the particular, fierce patience you bring to everything you touch. I do not know how to separate the truth we found from the way I feel about the woman who found it beside me." Marlowe felt her breath catch. 4 years of solitary grief finally making room for something she had never let herself hope to feel again. "Then don't separate them," she told him, drawing closer. Nix curled protectively around them both in the quiet aftermath of a truth 2 years and 4 years overdue. "Let the truth and the love both belong to the same story. I think that is exactly what my sister would have wanted for me, and I think it is exactly what Nix has been waiting this whole time to finally be part of too." Word of Voss's confession and Nix's restored standing spread through the Corps within days, and the same senior trainers who had once whispered about the dragon's dangerous temperament now spoke of Marlowe with a respect she had never expected to earn from a position most of them had considered beneath notice. She found she cared less about their changed opinion than she once might have, her attention fixed instead on the quiet, ordinary mornings ahead of her, Nix settled and at peace in his enclosure, and Alistair's hand steady in hers as the whole slow, patient work of building something new finally began in earnest.